Hi, I'm James,
And I'm Anthony.
and this is Words and Numbers. How you doing this week, Ant?
James, okay. I've been watching in the news. One of the big things that I've seen this week is this nurse in Utah who was arrested because she refused to take blood from an unconscious man at the police request.
Yeah, no, this turned into quite the fiasco out here in Utah, where I live. I'm about 100 miles dead north of Salt Lake City, and this is really all we've heard about for quite some time out here, and with good reason. The nurse, her name is Alex Wubbles, refused to draw blood on a crime victim, not a criminal, but a crime victim, saying that she could only do that if the patient were conscious and gave consent, was under arrest, or if the police had a warrant. And she even cited a 2016 Supreme Court decision as she made her case to the officers in the emergency room. Detective Jeff Payne was unimpressed, and he told her, and you could see this in the body cam video that's been released. He said, "I either go away with blood in vials or a body in tow." And he ended up arresting Wubbles at that point.
And this is after she got her supervisor on the phone talking to his supervisor, saying that, and everybody's agreeing that yes, these are the three conditions, and yes, none of them are met.
And yet we're going to do this anyway. Yeah, no, it turned out to be a real fiasco with, cell phones out and people being called. And it's just what you would expect a confusing situation in an emergency room to be. But nonetheless, Wubbles was arrested for interfering, whatever that actually means. She's no longer under arrest, and charges are clearly not going to be pursued against her. But that's just the beginning of the fallout. In the days that followed, Payne and another officer, as of just yesterday, have been placed on leave. I believe it's paid leave, but it's leave nonetheless. And the Salt Lake City mayor, Jackie Biskupski, issued an apology directly to Wubbles and online for all to see, and Police Chief Mike Brown did the same. So I suspect we're not done with this by a long shot.
Yeah, and the weird thing about the whole business is that she's upholding what she perceived, and apparently correctly so, according to her supervisor, the policy that the police and the hospital had jointly agreed to. And more than that, the policy is consistent with previous Supreme Court rulings. So it's a very odd situation where she's the one that's upholding the rule, and the police officer is requiring her to break the rules. In effect, violating this unconscious man's right to his privacy.
Right, there's only a couple of possibilities here, right? Either she's right or the police officer is, or she's ignorant or he is. There's really not a lot of ways this one's going to break down. But in the end, I think it leads us to a series of questions that we do well to answer in the cold light of day before things become tense and strife-ridden in an emergency room. And I think the big question that we've got before us is, how should police be accountable if and when they violate the law in pursuance of their duties? And this is a question that comes up in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, and I think it's worth underlining here that this particular case, there are plenty of cases in which it's less clear, but this particular case, nobody was trying to make a decision in the stress of the moment. Everybody had plenty of time to think this through and talk it through, and yet we ended up in this space where the police are requiring people to behave in certain ways that not only are illegal, but the police are then turning around and arresting the people for behaving in what is a perfectly legal fashion.
Right, and what we end up with is a situation in which the police are very rarely individually accountable for the things they do under color of law, which turn out to be not legal. Right, this is where we're at. Right, we have police who can violate the law and skirt accountability because of this concept in the United States law called qualified immunity.
So qualified immunity, for those who aren't familiar with the term, means, and correct me if I'm wrong, James, it means basically that the police officer cannot be held, assuming he's working within the confines of his job, cannot be held civilly liable. So in other words, even though he hasn't done anything, even if he hasn't done something that's technically illegal, if he were not a police officer and he were infringing on someone's rights, imposing harm, that person who was harmed could file a civil action, which is, there's no criminal question about this. It's simply a disagreement between private parties. But according to qualified immunity, the police are insulated from civil action. You cannot file a civil suit in cases like this.
Yeah, that's right. And this comes from a couple of Supreme Court decisions. The first is Bivens versus 6 unknown named agents, which is a 1971 case. Later in Harlow versus Fitzgerald, a 1982 case. And ultimately, qualified immunity shields government agents from liability, as you say, unless their actions are found to violate an individual's constitutional rights. Right? So there's the kicker for you. Even if officials' actions are later found to be illegal, qualified immunity applies if they did not violate what was called clearly established law, which is going to lead us to a strange and wondrous thing in just a minute, because, what clearly established law actually means where the rubber meets the road is a little murky.
But before we even get there, we're stopping and underlining the fact that to this point with qualified immunity, the police are, according to law, above the law. That is, they can do things that a regular human being in the same circumstances with the same knowledge could be sued for or could even go to jail for. The police are immune from prosecution in these instances.
Yeah, that's right. They're utterly immune if they meet some very minimal standards along the way. And in the end, it's incredibly difficult to hold them accountable in any realistic way for actions that they undertake in pursuance of their jobs, right? So we get things like this, right? Officers, and this applies to other governmental officials, right? It's not specifically about police officers. Qualified immunity covers a host of any number of people who work for the government, but they're immune from damages. And here's the money quote: as long as their actions reasonably could have been thought consistent with the rights they are alleged to have violated. Right. So, yeah, almost anything you do, if you can make a case that, you were doing your best and it was the heat of the moment, well, you can understand why we would have tried qualified immunity in the first place. I think maybe it's been a failure, but you can understand the very reasonable circumstances that brought it about in the first place.
Well, it gets even worse than this, because it's not just a matter of the police being immune from prosecution in the case of of civil actions like this, but it's also the case that they aren't required to know the law.
Well, that's right. And this comes up in another Supreme Court case from 2014 called Hine versus North Carolina, in which the United States Supreme Court decided, I think fantastically in a lot of ways, that police ignorance of the law is acceptable, that ignorance of the law can be, and sometimes is, a reasonable mistake, and we have to just overlook it.
Now, ignorance of the law is a reasonable mistake. Now, imagine for a moment if this law were not referring to police officers, but to medical professionals. It would say something like the following: if the medical professional is ignorant of the state of medicine, that's not a prosecutorial offense. That's astounding.
If you go to the emergency room and they declare that what you really need is a good leeching, and you die, well, they tried.
Right. I mean, we have a word for that. That's medical malpractice, right? We have medical malpractice. We have legal malpractice when lawyers basically don't know their own jobs. And here we have police that there would otherwise be this thing we could call law enforcement malpractice. But the Supreme Court has said, no, there cannot be such a thing. The police indeed do not have to be aware of the laws that they are enforcing.
Ultimately, we'll get back to malpractice as a possible solution to this mess later on. But really, the Supreme Court has come down in a couple of meaningful ways and said, on the one hand, police can't be held civilly liable for their actions on the job as long as you meet these minimal conditions. And then the police don't even have to be fully aware of what the law is when they seek to enforce the law, as long as these other minimal issues are satisfied in some way, shape, or form. So it becomes very, very difficult to hold police accountable. And we ask the question, what limits police power in the United States? And the answer has to be not much, right?
Right.
And in the end, I think the only thing that can limit police power is public opinion. And I think we're seeing that begin to shift, right? There's a number of people out there, sadly, who line up behind the police no matter what they do and become apologists for the police. And I think, we're probably always going to have that group of people. On the other hand, there's a group on the other side who think the police can do nothing right, and we're probably always going to have them too. But in that rational middle, where we really have to be concerned with what people think, that the tide seems to be shifting there. And I think it shifts in no small part because of the ubiquitous nature of video cameras that we see everywhere, right? Everybody carries a video camera in his pocket. And the police have come under enhanced scrutiny from these and from their own body cameras, as these things go, when people see how they behave. And who's coming out swinging against the use of video cameras in policing? Well, the police themselves, right? They would prefer if nobody ever videotaped them as they did their jobs. I'm actually sympathetic. I get that. I understand that. Although they are public servants paid by tax dollars, and if the citizens are in public recording them, I doubt that there's much of a leg to stand on to tell them that they can't. That said, we have differing opinions at the circuit court level, and this is undoubtedly going to the United States Supreme Court for some kind of final resolution sometime soon. Hard to say when. My guess is probably next year. But in the meantime, what you get on the one hand are the police and their supporters standing on the danger argument, right? The police do a very dangerous job and therefore are entitled to all kinds of benefit of the doubt. So I thought maybe it would do us well to get into this a little bit and figure out just how dangerous the job of the police actually is.
Of course, the situation here is we have a tendency to give police the maximum leeway because they, as people say, they put their lives on the line every day, and this is the thing that people repeat. And certainly, there's no question that there are police who have put their lives on the line and do repeatedly. But it's important to look at things in context, right? If you compare on-the-job fatality rates for police in the United States to on-the-job fatality rates for workers in other industries, what you find is that the police aren't even in the top 10. If you break it down by jobs, in terms of on-the-job fatalities, police rank about 15. The number one job for workers who actually are putting their lives on the line when they go out on the job are loggers. And their on-the-job fatality rate is 8 times that of police. Followed by fishermen, aircraft pilots, actually sanitation workers actually have a higher on-the-job fatality rate than the police. And again, that's not to disparage the contribution, the sacrifice that police make, but it is to put it in context that if we're going to cut this particular group of people who perform this job, if we're going to cut them a break legally in terms of qualified immunity and these other things, because they're putting their lives on the line, it's worth asking, to what extent is that the case? And if we're going to do it for police, maybe even more so, we should be doing it for loggers.
Right, and loggers 8 times as dangerous in terms of lives lost as policing. Garbage men suffer 3 times, almost 3 times the number of fatalities, on-the-job fatalities, as the police. And we should go a little further and say this isn't simply a matter of counting up how many police officers are shot by criminals, right? These are deaths on the job.
Right. Right. From all sources combined, you could die of a heart attack and you're going to show up in these statistics. But if you look, and the interesting thing is the FBI keeps detailed records on people who are people who shoot police. There aren't as many detailed records on people who are shot by police. But the Washington Post is starting to put together some data on this. But if you compare people who shoot police versus people who are shot by police, the numbers start to look relatively interesting. Law enforcement officer on-the-job fatalities in 2015, so that's one of the latest years that data is available. There are 141 on-the-job fatalities. And if you take out those that were due to accidents, and let's look only at law enforcement officers who were shot, stabbed, or killed by vehicular assault, you're talking 49 officers nationwide in 2015. But now if we start to look at people who were shot by the police, now, of course, there are people who were shot, and deservedly so. But let's break the numbers down, people who were shot by police who were not armed, not exhibiting any signs of mental illness, were not attacking the police, and you're now at 49, roughly the same number. And so it raises this question of, if indeed the police are going to claim that they're putting their lives on the line as they go out and they do their policing, to the same extent, the people who are being policed are putting their lives on the line, because as many of them are being killed by police as are killing police in return.
Right. And with the stipulation that neither of us thinks any police officer should ever be killed in the line of duty, nor do we think that any innocent person should be killed by police. Really, we're looking at about 50 on either side of the coin in a country of about 350 million people.
Yeah, in the great scheme of things, the numbers are, and they're happily low. But they are low. And so it raises the question, should we really be pointing to things like this and saying this is why we have qualified immunity? I don't see much evidence here that something as a huge legal tool like qualified immunity is the appropriate response for the numbers that we're seeing.
Right, but the question does emerge, how do we want police to treat citizens? And what protections do we want there to be in place? Because, of course, we want something. That said, we want something that works well, and works at a relatively low cost. And here, I think we have a market-based solution that would satisfy almost everything that qualified immunity satisfies without the tremendous cost that comes with it. It's simple malpractice insurance, the same thing that we talked about earlier with doctors and nurses and lawyers. Why shouldn't police officers carry malpractice insurance?
Yeah, the interesting thing, if we did require police to carry malpractice insurance, like we do for doctors, and for example, what would happen is the insurance companies themselves would have a profit incentive to monitor the police, not as a group even, but individually, and to say, this particular police officer engages in practices that are more risky. He does things that are more on the edge that maybe he shouldn't be doing, and therefore we're going to raise his malpractice insurance. So all of a sudden, that particular, and we call them bad apples, right? That particular bad apple all of a sudden becomes much more expensive for his employers.
Right, and it would have the net effect, right? Sooner or later, bad apples would literally be unable to obtain insurance in an open market.
Right. They'd be too expensive to employ.
Nobody would actually give them the insurance, and then they would have to go find another line of work. So on the back end, you see how this would actually be a pretty effective tool in weeding out the bad apples. But I submit that it would be even better than that, because on the front end, if an officer knew that he was required to obtain malpractice insurance, I submit that his behavior on the front end would change too, right? Because people respond to incentives. And if the incentive is to get the malpractice insurance in order to keep doing your job, you're going to make sure that you care and treat people pretty well.
Yeah. And I think there's another thing that goes along with this, which is with the malpractice insurance, we can get rid of qualified immunity. There's no need then to shield officers from civil lawsuits because, if they are, taken to court because of something they did while working as a police officer, and they're found, the ruling goes against them. The insurance company then, because of the malpractice insurance, would pay the fine. So the officer himself isn't out the cash. So there's no need to hide behind qualitative immunity. But also, it gives some recompense for people like this nurse in Salt Lake City, to say, look, I have been seriously wronged. I'm going to file a civil suit, and she can now get redress because the qualified immunity is not standing in her way. So I think the malpractice insurance solves all sorts of problems here.
Yeah, no, have we arrived at a situation in which everybody can win? I'm going to throw it to you for the last word.
Well, I think so. I think we've been hard on the police here, and I think it's absolutely worth remembering that the majority of police are not bad. They're good people out there trying to do a good job as best they can. They're conscientious people, right? The problem here, and I think it's something I've heard repeatedly from police, is their quandary as well. How do we deal with the bad apples? Well, this is an excellent way to do it. Let the market handle it, and the market will handle it in the same way that it handles the bad apples in the medical profession, the legal profession, and elsewhere.
And that's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Be sure to join us next week, Wednesday, round about noon Eastern Time, for another episode. Until then, check out the great content at fee.org and at Fee Online. And you could also find us at wordsandnumbers.org. Until next week, Ant, take it easy.
See you next week, James.